Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SQ-80-V tutorial series. Got a preset deep dive for you today. This preset called Rock Waves. It sounds like this. Most of the action on this sound kicks off when we start messing with the modulation wheel because we get this. There's an awful lot going on there. And we're going to break that down today. If you've enjoyed this video series, check out the Patreon link or the YouTube join button below to become a channel member. Fabulous way to help support my channel. Huge thanks to everybody who has so far. Okay, here we go. There are a lot of moving parts in this preset and we're going to need to throw a lot of them away to have any chance of really figuring out what's going on. The first thing that we're going to do is have a look at the effects bank, because we've got 4 effects units and they're all plumbed in to the modulation wheel. And this is one of the issues that we have when we're deconstructing this particular preset, that some of the modulation sources, particularly the modulation wheel and LFO1, are mapped to multiple different sources. So they're doing so many different jobs, it's really difficult to pick out any individual thing. The reason I've chosen to start with the effects is because it's relatively straightforward to pick each of them out in turn. In order to hear pretty much anything of what's going on here, I'm going to have to turn the modulation wheel up, because as you can see, their native levels are mostly 0, tiny bit of reverb. And so I'll set the modulation wheel to maximum. It's going to bring in a load of other crazy stuff. Let's just ignore that for the moment. So, delay. There's the delay. Let's turn it off. We've dealt with that. Little bit of reverb. Tiny bit more when we've increased the modulation wheel, but it's really tiny. Let's not worry about that. We'll jump over the multi-filter at the moment. Juno Chorus. You can hear the chorus effect. Let's throw that away. The reason why I've left the multi-filter to the last is because it's going to involve having a conversation about what's going on with the LFO. Because unless I'm sorely mistaken, I think there's a bug in the interface when it comes to LFO modulation. I'll try to show you how it's manifesting. For the time being, let's just try to catch if we can hear this cutoff. Now I can definitely hear a filter sweep, but if we head over to the synthesis page, you'll see that we've also got some modulation mapped to the standard low-pass filter. I want to take all of that modulation off just so that we can really understand what we're hearing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create myself a preset at this point so that I can get back here if I need to. And now I'm going to disengage all of the modulation values for the LPF, and I've made that static. And now we can definitely hear that high pass sweep, and you can see it. And here's the issue we've got. Have a look at how much modulation is being applied here. We've got full LFO being dialed in at 1, and yet this little blue dot is travelling halfway backwards and forwards. Let's have a look at how much amplitude is being applied by the LFO. Here's the issue. LFO1's a flat line. So why are we getting any modulation at all? LFO1 is supposed to be a sine wave, but in this particular configuration, as I've got the controls set right now, with the modulation wheel all the way at maximum, you can see we've got negative modulation on the LFO. So with the wheel at maximum, the sine wave is flatlining. We shouldn't be hearing any high pass filter, and yet we do. Unfortunately, the wheel is also tied to the level of the effect, so we're not going to hear it. What I need to do is basically disengage the modulation wheel from the level so that we can actually hear this effect. So that's the high pass filter sweeping as far as it possibly can, all the way from minimum to maximum. And so the bug that I think we've got is that if the modulation wheel is being used as a modulation source for the LFO, it's operating as if it's bipolar. In other words, from minimum to maximum on this perceived range is internally only having a 50% effect on the modulation amount, which is why when I turn my modulation wheel all the way up, the LFO is flatlined. The LFO is now correct. It's not doing anything. That display is correct. Here's the little blue line at 0. and yet as far as this modulation target is concerned, it's still having a 50% effect. So that's just something to do with, I don't know whether, I might be getting this completely wrong, I might be just fundamentally misunderstanding something, but I think that's the modulation wheel being interpreted as a bipolar source, and it shouldn't be. So just to bear in mind, there's that little bit of a quirk in the preset, and it makes things a bit tricky, because what we're seeing isn't truly what we're hearing. That said, I'm going to get us back to our waypoint that I loaded earlier, and turn all the effects off, and now we'll just have a look at the synthesis engine and try to figure out what's going on over here. Let's have a look at the oscillators next to figure out what's going on over here. We're actually hearing a power chord, in other words, a fundamental with perfect fifths. That's what generates that big, fat, thick sound. It's what heavy metal guitarists play when they throb away on the bottom two strings of the guitar. This is a perfect fifth interval, and the fundamental is coming from oscillator 3. So let's start there. You can see that it's detuned by 2 octaves, but that doesn't particularly matter. We've got no semitone offset. There's a tiny little bit of vibrato coming from the LFO. We'll look at that in a minute. Firstly, the note. So here's our C at 65 Hertz. Now oscillators 1 and 2 are doing a weird thing, and I can't for the life of me figure out why. Oscillator 1 has tuned itself down 1 octave plus another 5 semitones. That's basically 7 semitones higher than the fundamental. This is going to make a G at then 97-ish Hertz. Oscillator 2 has pitched itself down by 2 octaves and then come back up 5. Well, that's the same note, just very slightly offset. So why one of them has been pitched, well, I don't know why they've been pitched in that way, but basically they're both generating the same note. They're doubling up on that perfect fifth above the fundamental, and so when we add those 2 oscillators together, we get this lovely kind of unison sound as those 2 notes play off each other. Now the reason why they're so harmonically rich and interesting and washy is because all of these oscillators are having tiny amounts of vibrato added to them from LFO3. You can see all of them have got this tiny little bit. Let's bring the fundamental back in as well. Tiny little bit of vibrato from LFO3, which is this triangle cycling very quickly. If I disengage that vibrato from all 3 oscillators, we lose that little bit of interest. It's a really lovely, very subtle effect. I keep saying this with vibrato, subtle is best. Just get us back to our temporary sound again. So all 3 together with the vibrato. There's obviously tons of other modulation going on as well. Let's figure out what all that is. You can see all 3 of the oscillators, all 3 of the waves, are having their pulse width modulated. Now primarily the modulation is coming from the mixer. The mixer suffers the same issue that we saw in the effects unit earlier, so don't take completely for granted that what you're seeing is exactly what's being manifested. For instance, I can make the sine waves of LFO 1 and 2 absolutely flat, and yet you can quite clearly see that the mixer is still oscillating as a sine wave. So just, bear in mind that that caveat still applies. But essentially what the mixer's doing is mixing LFO1, which is this slow moving sine wave, together with LFO2, which is generating noise, and you can see that the speed of LFO2 is fully mapped to the modulation wheel, yet another one of the things that the modulation wheel's doing. And when the modulation wheel's all the way down, you can see that the rate of progress through this noise sample is very, very slow. So it's basically at that point acting like almost a sample and hold generator, where it's generating fixed values for a while and then moving to the next fixed value. When I start bringing the modulation wheel in, this thing becomes a genuine noise generator, and the mixer takes on this aspect. What that's doing is acting as a modulation source to all of these oscillators, and you can see the pulse width oscillating wildly. That's what's giving us that violent, broken sound. So as you can see, it's slowly pulling up and down as it travels through its modulation phase, but then the violent crossfading between these two modulation targets is causing the oscillation. So the thing is basically oscillating wildly whilst also slowly travelling up and down this grade, and it's that you're hearing. It's almost like an extra LPF or HPF that's being applied to the sound, this extra filter that's sweeping through the range. It's actually pulse width that's doing it. Let's turn all of the other filters off to really prove that. We'll turn the multi-filter off. I'll once again disengage everything to do with the low pass filter. And you can hear this sweep. So that's the pulse width sweep that you're hearing. While we're having a look at the oscillators, let's just have a quick look at the voices, because this is a mono unison sound. So it doesn't matter if I play 3 notes of a C major chord, you're only actually hearing one of those notes. It happened to be the E then. But again, all of that fatness is coming from the fact that all of the voices of the synthesizer are being used in unison mode. And as you can see down here, we've got 7 voices being assigned to this sound. This is all helping to add to this thickness. Continuing with the theme of multitasking for the modulation sources, you can see that the DCAs are also using the modulation wheel. This poor old modulation wheel is being pulled and torn in all sorts of different directions. We've also got LFO. So this is just the volume of the different oscillators being varied with respect to each other. It's not going to have a fundamental effect on the sound. If I take away all of these modulations, basically you're still going to hear the same thing, just slightly less interesting because the relative volumes of all of those oscillators aren't being modulated anymore. Throw all those changes away again. I'm just going to take this multi-filter out permanently and resave that so I don't have to worry about it again. Now with the filter it's a little bit confusing because we've got modulation being assigned from the modulation wheel to the resonance value, but it's negative, and yet the resonance level is all the way to 0. So it's not actually doing anything at the moment. I could turn this off and have no effect on the LPF. So maybe that was an artifact of when the preset was being designed. It's been left behind, I'm not sure, but it's not actually doing anything. The only modulation of any value is coming from the mod wheel, which is basically increasing the cutoff rate, as you can see. And we've also got this variable modulation amount coming from the mixer. So if I increase the mod wheel, in addition to the craziness that's being applied to the pulse width, causing all of that violent noise breakup, you can also hear the overall tone of the sound being brightened by the cutoff filter being dragged up. And finally, LFO1, in addition to doing a million other things, is also affecting the pan. So we've got this very gentle pan, this slowly oscillating cycle. Now at the moment my mod wheel is turned all the way up. So if I bring it down, now the modulation's at its maximum effect. Pull the mod wheel up, and again, can you see it's actually travelling halfway around the range that it should be? That's another manifestation of this modulation wheel issue. We should have a flat line on the modulation here, and we actually don't. We have 50%. Let's hear the pan as we bring the modulation in. All the way left. And that's it for this deep dive and series. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.